Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of An Astronomer Critiques Creation. And the video that I'll be looking at this time is from um, when Bill Nye toured the Ark with Ken Ham. Um, Frankly, this is a very difficult thing to watch, mostly from the way that Bill and Ken try to talk over each other. But before we dig into the video, I wanted to read something from the Jewish Publication Society commentary on Genesis, written by Nahum Smarna. And for me, much like the passage from John Peter Lange, this short blurb is about all that is dedicated to this controversy. I shouldn't say controversy because in the Jewish culture it's really not terribly as controversial as it is in American society between fundamentalist Christians and non-fundamentalists. For many in the Jewish faith, and I can say this with a level of authority, a small level of authority, because I taught high school at a Jewish academy for a year and got to know several of my Jewish colleague faculty in both the liberal arts fields as well as some of the rabbis. And I, in fact, had a few conversations about creation and the Jewish line of thought with creation. And per normal, he indicated that many Jews have a wide spectrum of their beliefs about creation, but by and large, they don't put a lot of emphasis on it in terms of the importance of whether the days were literal or whether the days weren't literal. It's just not terribly important to most Jewish theology. It doesn't harm or help their interpretations of the rest of Scripture, whether it is interpreted in 24-hour literal days or not. But I'd like to read this passage because, once again, this for me kind of captures the essence of my personal thought about how Genesis ought to be interpreted, and where or how the text rather places the rest of the Bible in context, along with the early Jews, early Hebrews, who wrote and would have contributed to the writing, the oral stories that were passed down that finally came down into the finished form, as well as placing them in the context of their other Near East ancient cultures. And so this is what Nahum Smarna has to say. The mystery of divine creativity is, of course, ultimately unknowable. The Genesis narrative does not seek to make intelligible what is beyond human ken, to draw upon human language to explain that which is outside any model of human experience is inevitably to confront the inescapable limitations of any attempt to give verbal expression to the subject. For this reason alone, The narrative, in its external form, must reflect the time and place of its composition. Thus, it directs us to take account of the characteristic modes of literary expression current in ancient Israel. It forces us to realize that a literalistic approach to the text must inevitably confuse idiom with idea, symbol with reality. The result would be to obscure the enduring meaning of that text. And it is that last sentence that absolutely resonates with me. When we try to force Scripture into saying something that we want it to say rather than what the original authors meant or could have understood or could have envisioned, then we absolutely do harm to the text. We do harm to the meaning of the text, its interpretation, how we view it, and how we implement it. And in my view, that is where creation science falls. And again, I'm not here to attack people's ideas, and I don't want people to take that away. I'm here to attempt to show where the creation science ideal or platform fails scientifically. And because it does, it is therefore not a good resource by which to do science. And, some people might say, okay, well, that's just kind of a gatekeeper mentality. Who are you to defend the integrity of science like that? Just let people be. And there may be some validity to that. I can fully accept somebody's opinion in that matter. But for me as a science educator, the more we as a society struggle with basic science education, and the more we question not scientists. I don't have a problem with people questioning scientists, but because the scientific method has proven to be so invaluable in terms of improving the quality of life of human beings, in terms of the longevity of life of human beings with medicine, and our technological applications to allow us to communicate instantly across the world. We can locate ourselves, for better or for worse, to within just a few feet using GPS. We have managed to, with this technology, introduce great evil into the world. Human trafficking is at all-time highs, if I'm not mistaken, in part because of the ease with which people can lure potential prey on the internet, potential targets on the internet, and communicating nefariously with organizations, people talking to each other in different countries and continents, organizing routes and things has become a lot easier. So it is easier to do a lot of harm because of our technology, but it's also introduced a lot of good. And so because science is what has driven our very societal structure, it behooves us to understand what is and is not good science. And that is the motivation that I have with this series. So with that being said, we're going to watch a few minutes of the ARC tour between Bill Nye and Ken Ham. As I said, this is a difficult watch. We're not going to do too many episodes on this because this particular encounter alone could eat up several episodes, and I don't have that kind of time to invest. But so we'll watch a few minutes. But if you watch this yourself, just be prepared that Ken and Bill both um, get very excited at points and try to make um, their points and end up talking over each other and almost to the point of seemingly rude. And I would say that both were at some point or other rude in the conversation. But so this is when the film crews start, and we'll go into a few minutes, and then we will dissect a little bit.
All right.
Oh, we're ready, but I'm not sure he is. They are.
So we'll take the elevator to the third and then
Yeah,
work our way
okay.
down.
So, Ben, if you want to look after getting the elevator for us.
So we're really rolling. So, Mr. Ham, are these chines for stability?
Yeah. It's built with 3 keels because we had an architect who's involved
There's
in
a
marine
concrete
engineering.
shell, right?
No, they're concrete piers. They go down to
I know,
actually
but
solid rock.
There's a shell above this.
Oh, yeah.
Like, in other words, Mr. Ham, this ship is not seaworthy, is it? What do you,
We didn't
what do you
build.
say to kids? Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't
That's
build
what
it to float because there's never going to be another global flood. So
How do you know that?
It was designed as a ship, but built as a building. So how do I know that? Well, on the basis of the Bible. I know I believe the Bible is God's word, and I know you don't, but on the basis of the Bible, after the flood, God said there'll never be another global flood again. Been lots of local floods, but not a global
When
flood.
did he, where does this say that?
Genesis chapter 10. Oh, sorry, Genesis chapter 9. God said there's a covenant between him and man and him and the animals, and the rainbow was the sign of that covenant, that there would never be another flood as the one that he sent.
So, rainbows, what makes a rainbow? Would there be rainbows without that covenant?
Oh, yeah, I think the rainbow, it doesn't say that that's when God made the rainbow, it just says that the rainbow was to be a sign. In other words, anytime you see a rainbow, it's to be a reminder. In other words, a reminder that there'll never be another global flood. So yeah, a rainbow would exist when you have
Well,
the
will,
right
we,
amount of
will we
light.
see a rainbow today?
Will we see a rainbow today? We might. Once the sun is seen through the clouds there, you never know, we might.
You might, but when it's the middle of the day, the sun's high, and you seldom get that directed angle to create a rainbow. Once in a while. Careful, careful. Yeah. So what goes on here in the Ice Age?
Well, one of the things that we're talking about is the Ice Age was generated by the flood. In other words, you know, those who believe in evolution actually believe
I'm
in
sorry,
ice
so
ages.
your claim is that there was an Ice Age 4,000 years ago?
The Ice Age was back towards the flood.
What do you
yeah.
base that on?
What do we base that on? Well, as you know,
Here we have evidence for this.
Yeah.
But what's the evidence for that?
no, we don't have evidence for that. That's an interpretation. You can't find ice that has labels on it.
Yes, you can.
Label?
Okay, so you can't find ice that has labels on it. This is where any reputable scientist, whether they accept creation or not, any reputable scientist would and should stop Ken right here. Nature does not communicate to us in labels. Okay? You're never going to uncover a rock and that rock have a label from a label maker, unless somebody put it there as a joke. But the information about that rock, the history of that rock, the origin of that rock, whether it's igneous, whether it's sedimentary, whatever the rock's origin, is not going to be on a label in any language. a human language, English or Russian or Chinese or whatever. Nature doesn't communicate to us in that fashion. And the entire enterprise of science is built on knowing something so you can then infer something else. And by knowing something, what I really mean is being relatively confident in that thing. So, for example, I love talking about electricity because we still don't know what electric charge is, and that just fascinates me that our entire modern civilization is built on the idea of electric charge, current and voltage and power, electric power, and yet we still don't know what charge is. But this kind of thing, making inferences about phenomena or objects that aren't labeled in English, is how science is done. It's how we discovered that there were two types of charge, positive and negative. When people started realizing, particularly in the 17 and 1800s, how to create charged objects through friction, like rubbing rubber rods with fur or glass rods with silk. When you rubbed rubber with fur and when you rubbed glass with silk, if you could suspend those rods from strings and bring those rods close to each other, they would attract. And when you would bring two rubber rods that have been rubbed with fur close to each other, suspended by strings, they would try to repel. And the same thing with the glass rods. And okay, you can from that infer that there are two types of charge, call it rubber rod charge and glass rod charge. But that doesn't preclude that there are other types of charges out there. But through really rigorous experimentation, we were able to rule out that there was a third type of charge that interacted electrically with the other two types of charge. And as a result, that inference that there were only two types of electric charge is what we have built not only the technologies of our modern society on, but the fundamental theory of quantum mechanics is built on. If we were to discover a third type of charge and that interacted with an electron in a different way than other electrons and other protons do, or other types of charged particles, it would upend physics. It would absolutely, but nobody's ever seen an electric charge. And so when you do measurements like Coulomb did, when he derived, or I shouldn't say derived, when he discovered Coulomb's law empirically, he had to make inference after inference after inference about the nature of electric charge without ever having proof for it or having, as Ken is saying, a label for it. So science is not done by expecting labels or things that are written. They're done by careful observation and understanding what the fundamental principles of the subject you are using to study something. In this case, when you're studying the ages of ice cores, the fundamental principles are those of radioactive decay. We won't go into the full-blown description of radioactive decay here. I might in another video, especially if people would like me to. But when you understand what decay rates are and what statistics are telling you about objects that decay radioactively, you can then be very confident in your result when you age these ice cores with various dating methods. There's potassium argon dating. There is uranium 238 to 234 dating. So there's various dating methods, and especially if you can get multiple samples, a sample of potassium argon and a sample of uranium, in the same ice core, and they give relatively close to the same value, then that just bolsters your confidence in your measurement even further. And by the way, there is no such thing as a perfect measurement. So when we talk about ages, and we talk about some rocks are dated using uranium and other types of long half-life radioactive material, there's no such thing as a perfect measurement. There will always be measurement uncertainty. And if you've ever seen a measurement that has the number plus or minus a smaller number, that plus or minus is what we call the uncertainty. That's the range of values over which we're relatively confident. Ideally, we would be 95% confident that our result falls in that uncertainty mark. But depending on how you use uncertainty and the methods you use to determine that line may be a little bit fuzzy. But in general, that means that we're more confident than not that our measurement falls within that range. And so when we talk about, labels, we aren't talking about words written in English. We're not talking about turning over an ice core that we've dug up and it, blast in our face, 150,000 years old, with a bullhorn. We're not talking about that. We're talking about painstakingly looking at the constituents of the non-water atoms in those pieces of ice, determining what they are, determining the number of those substances, and when we can match radioactive parent-daughter isotopes like potassium and argon or uranium 238, 234, then we can count how many of each there are, and we can get a very accurate, to within the uncertainty bounds of the method itself, the ages of those ice cores. So any reputable scientist knows that whether you agree that radio dating itself is a good method or should be trusted heavily, any good scientist knows that the entire structure of science is built on taking things that we know, we've measured decay rates in the laboratory, and then applying that to what we find in nature. And from that we draw inferences. And that is how science is done. And a lot of people may find that a little unsettling because it means scientists can never be quote unquote sure about things. But again, the more we repeat tests and the more we do observations of the same thing over and over again, and our results come back the same, as those things happen, our confidence increases to the point where we can say useful things. Once again, going back to electricity, if we didn't at least know something about electricity and the way it worked, then it would be a severe coincidence that when you plug in your toaster it works, that your fridge works, that your car starts, that your hairdryer worked, and that the electronic devices you're watching this video on work. That those would be less than 1 in a billion, that all those would work nearly all the time. And when they didn't work, you could troubleshoot it by finding a blown fuse, or in your car maybe a bad starter, or your battery's dead, or the coils in your hairdryer burn out. you can troubleshoot these things and fix them, and then they work again. If nature weren't allowing us to draw inferences and use inferences usefully, then we wouldn't have our modern society. So this is a point where I absolutely disagree with Ken, and have to harp on this stance of trying to demand labels, is nearly cartoonishly preposterous.
Absolutely.
Let's say I'm 300,000
Yes.
years old. Oh,
Yeah, sir, you're a science educator.
I've never seen one of those. Where do
You
you see
look
one of
and
those?
you count neutrons and oxygen atoms. That's how it's done.
Yeah, but
It's as though it has a label. Very much.
But it doesn't say I'm 300,000 years old.
Not in English, no.
No, you have to interpret it on the basis of certain assumptions.
Not in English. I love Bill's response there. Not in English.
That's right. You have
Or certain
assumptions.
discoveries.
No, assumptions. I mean,
Let's go with discoveries.
no, let's
Go ahead.
let's
Go ahead. How do you get
let's-
an ice age
let's-
4,000 years ago?
Let's go with assumptions, because whenever you're interpreting the past, you have to have certain basic assumptions about elements that were there and rates of change and all that sort of thing.
So you're saying, is this your observational science and historic?
Rates of change. I'll actually let Bill say what he's about to say, because I'll tie what I'm about to say into this.
Science?
Oh, absolutely.
So what
It's
are
not-
you,
it's
so
not
go ahead.
Okay, so if you watched, I'll play that little clip again.
So you're saying, is this your observational science and historical science?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so if you watched the debate in 2014 between Ham and Nye, which is another video that I will cover at some point, one of the things Ken talked about over and over and over again was this distinction between historical science and observational science. And this distinction is simply not one that practicing scientists take into account. Not that we don't think about it, but that we don't make the distinction for it. It doesn't serve any practical purpose to make the distinction. And what I mean by that is, if you read astronomy papers, particularly cosmology papers or deep time papers and things like that, you simply won't see the phrase historical science, okay, in papers from the Astronomical Journal or the Astronomy and Astrophysics, or the more reputable astronomy and theoretical cosmology journals. You simply won't see, according to historical science, we think thus. Okay? We don't make that distinction because all of what we know about astronomy, all of what we know about physics, and all of what we know about their subfields come from the same scientific method. The scientific method is simply rigorously test your ideas and perform observations and or experiments. You might not have a laboratory where you can set up an experiment, and astronomy is one of those places. You're constrained to observation itself, but you can still come up with predictions, and you can then test those predictions against observations. One of the most brilliant insights in all of science was done by a lady named Cecilia Payne. And she was the first woman to graduate from Harvard with a doctorate in astronomy as a woman. And her PhD thesis contained the solution to the puzzle of what were stars made out of. And that insight unlocked a host of information that then flowed from that discovery. But that discovery allowed for tests, because she came to the conclusion that stars were made of mostly hydrogen and some helium. And so then astronomers could then go look at star after star after star after star when spectrographs became sensitive enough to look at the composition, and they found that the spectral lines matched what we saw for the spectral lines of hydrogen and helium in the laboratory. And so here you have, pardon me, you have predictions that then are matched by observation over and over and over and over again. And astronomers would call this what Ken is labeling as historical science, because we're looking back in time. It takes time for the light to travel from a star to our eyes or to our telescopes. So we're doing historical science when we do astronomy, but we don't label it historical science the way that Ken is labeling it, because it makes no sense. We're still using the scientific method, and we have no reason at the current time to assume that any of our physical laws that we know of right now had varied in the past, especially significantly. It is possible that maybe perhaps things like the value of the speed of light was a different value at a different point in time, but we don't have any evidence that that was the case, and we have good reason to think that that wasn't the case. So when Ken and other creationists are talking about this distinction between historical and observational science and trying to separate looking back at things geologically or astronomically or biologically in the past versus what we do in the present day tabletop experiments with microscopes and so forth, they're trying to draw a distinction between the way science is done, how the scientific method is approached between geologists and astronomers versus modern day botanists and biologists. And that's simply not the case. The scientific method is the scientific method. It has different tools for different fields, for different eras, but at the end of the day, the process of the scientific method is the same. So I want to throw that out there. Whenever anybody talks about historical science versus observational science, it is literally a tool that was invented by creationists, and I cannot stress this enough. It was a tool invented by creationists to try and cast doubt on mainstream science. And there's a term that we have for that type of behavior where you create something to try and indoctrinate a subpopulation of people who of whom you have influence over, and that word is propaganda. This distinction between historical science and observational science, the way that Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis and other creation educators try to use it, is nothing but propaganda. Scientists do not use that distinction in their practice.
So
It's not my observational science, historical science.
So explain this. There, in my opinion, in my view, there's no evidence for an ice age 4,000 years ago.
Let me ask you a question. Did you want to walk through the ark, or did you just want to come up here and attack our beliefs?
So this is another point of frustration that I have with this interview. I'll let you hear Bill's response.
Well,
Because I did promise.
whichever you like, sir.
I did promise.
Whichever you like. This is why creationism is not science. This is why creationism is a religious belief alone. You maybe even could call it a philosophy. I would not go so far. I would simply call it a religious belief. Ken literally says, "Did you come here to attack our beliefs?" Science is not about attacking beliefs. Science is about attacking ideas. Ideas are attackable. Every scientific idea is attackable. If you're going to put a scientific idea out into the interverse, if you will, the universe of the internet, if you're going to put a scientific idea out there, whether you submit it to a journal for peer review, whether you post it on a blog, whether you try to write a book about it, whether you make a video about it, a PowerPoint presentation, anything you do regarding a scientific idea, and you put it out there for others to evaluate, you're opening yourself up for heavy criticism. And that is precisely what scientists do. Scientists have to be willing to take the criticism of their peers. And this is what creationism does not allow. Creationism does not allow itself to be questioned from within its own ranks. It does not have a mechanism by which to critique itself, other than to try and continually fit things into a preconceived idea. But real science doesn't do this. Real science seeks to find the best explanation that we can think of for a phenomenon. And to do that takes usually many people a long time and a lot of ideas, some of which turn out to be bad. So those bad ideas get weeded out by critique either during the peer review process or by subsequent scientists when they read papers and either try to recreate experiments or calculate derivations and things. When they find mistakes, they will point it out. And so nobody in the scientific community is above critique. Nobody in the scientific community is above critique. So if you're going to claim we're opening a science museum, none of your displays are off limits from criticism. None of your information is off limits from criticism, nor should it be. True science does not operate as a set of facts to be memorized, but as a body of knowledge that requires thorough testing. A body of knowledge that requires thorough testing when and where possible. And as a result, this attitude of Ken's is remarkably religious and not scientific. He gets very, very defensive when Bill tries to question him on the science, and he can only resort to religious, he backs himself into a religious corner, right? He does not address science. He addresses pseudoscience in a religious tone.
You'll walk through the Ark,
Okay.
and I know you want to head to the third floor because our teaching exhibits are here, but let me explain here. Actually, creationists have a mechanism for an ice age, because after the flood you got warm water, cool land, a lot of evaporation. You're going to have a mechanism for an ice age. What's your mechanism for ice ages? Because you would believe in ice ages, right? I mean, different ice ages over hundreds of thousands of years.
The eccentricity of the Earth's orbit?
Yeah, but I mean, you know, you're looking at that. You're looking at the Earth's orbits now, but what's your mechanisms for the different ice
Well,
ages?
we look at what the Earth was doing 300,000 years ago.
But you can't look at that. You can only see the Earth now.
Yeah, but you can see evidence of the past.
And again, this is completely baffling because we do look at inferences from what we know now to draw conclusions about what happened in the past. And I've mentioned the cherry picking before from Kent Hovind, but I'll reiterate it here, but it's in a slightly different form. The cherry picking that Ken is doing here is what is inferenceable or inferable and what is not inferable. And this version that Ken is presenting of creationism is cherry picking what's inferable and what's not inferable. Almost anybody, 40 anybody born 40 years from now, who would go to the Mount St. Helens remnant, the side of the volcano that was completely blown out, and the side of the volcano, what's left of it that's still standing, would absolutely infer that a volcanic explosion took place, and it would not be hard to find volcanic rock and lava flows that were still in the area. So any creationist who's born 40 years into the future, who goes to Mount St. Helens, would be able to see that for themselves, and it would be very natural to infer that a volcanic explosion occurred. So the cherry picking is saying, well, things are so old that we can't infer reliably, therefore we have to depend on the Bible, which you would have to demonstrate why the Bible is reliable scientifically first, which is a very tall order. And then second, how it matches with predictions across the board. So when he's talking about this issue of the ice ages, he's absolutely cherry picking because he knows very well there are things he would infer historically, but this is one he's disputing because he can. And so that is an absolutely classic example of cherry picking things between what you can try to dig into versus what you would absolutely get shut down trying to dig into, but it's still cherry picking nonetheless.
Well, we see evidence in the present.
So where
of
do you
past
draw the
processes.
line? This is what everybody wonders about your
Okay.
worldview.
Okay.
Where do you draw the line between what you can observe directly and what you can infer?
Well, I know that
If you come into a room and a window's open, do you presume that no one opened it because you weren't there to watch them open it?
This is an example where Bill kind of hammers on and doesn't let Ken answer a question.
well, the thing
If you
is,
see ice in a glass, do you presume it got there in the last few seconds because you weren't there to see the freezer create?
you know,
It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary worldview. Go ahead, lead on.
okay, so you don't want answers.
Sure, go ahead.
You just want to make statements without
Go
answers.
ahead.
You know, come on, we can have a friendly talk about these
Go
things.
ahead.
You know, you come up here in attack mode, Bill. Come on, let's not attack each other.
Go ahead.
Let's just be friendly. And I know you have a different worldview to me. And you know, when it comes to something like ice cube in a cup, I mean, we live in the present world and we've experienced those things. We've experienced ice cubes and we have cups, and that's something that's within our life's experiences, and it's very easy to infer that somebody put that ice in that cup. But when it comes to talking about the past when we weren't there and things we didn't experience, that's very different. And that's where we need to have an understanding of the difference between interpretation and what you actually observe in the present and had experience with.
So let's talk about this again. What makes you think this was 4,000 years ago?
What makes us think that that was 4,000 years ago? Well, first of all, we take the
Okay, so what Bill is asking for is not just a claim that an ice age happened due to the flood, but what is precisely the prediction or the observation that was made using ice or glaciers or whatever the material was. What is causing you to say precisely 4,000 years from a scientific view? That is what Bill is asking.
chronology in the Bible, And the chronology in the Bible is that Noah's flood was about 4,300 years ago. And so that...
Extremely specific prediction, but based only on the chronology in the Bible, which would assume that there are no missed generations listed anywhere. And if you take the view of absolute infallibility of Scripture, then that's not a problem. But when you learn how many different times the Bible has been translated, and if you actually study the New Testament in some detail and understand how many times and in different eras, scribes, especially in the 11, 12, 1300s, writing down texts, would purposefully make mistakes or purposefully add or purposefully subtract. It becomes a tall order to then, when they were transcribing the New Testament particularly, it becomes a very tall order to then say that nothing has been changed or no information was corrupted from the earliest time that these manuscripts were written. And the manuscripts, the earliest, when Genesis would have been written down, when the Pentateuch would have first been written down, most of the stories about the creation, about Adam and Eve, about the garden, about the Tower of Babel, about the flood with Noah, about Abraham, would have all been passed down orally several times, several generations before Moses. So, assuming that you accept that Moses physically wrote the Pentateuch, so it's a very, very tall order to establish that firmly from a historical standpoint. And so what Ken is trying to do is base an entire worldview on the idea that the Bible is not or has not been corrupted in any way, shape, or form. And especially when it comes to genealogies, the length of genealogies, I don't know too many people who would claim that if a individual or a few individuals got left out of the lists of chronologies, that it would disrupt, destroy, or impair the integrity of the message of the Bible itself. So you have to demonstrate, if you're going to take this view that Ham is, you have to demonstrate beyond a shred of a doubt that no corruption had occurred at all throughout the transmission of the Pentateuch, which is very difficult. I don't know a biblical scholar that at least I'm familiar with that would be willing to take that challenge and be able to actually demonstrate that conclusively, or at least argue it convincingly. There may be, some conservative Bible scholars out there who would be able to do a much better job than I'm envisioning, but for the most part, it's a very tall challenge at the very least. And so you're basing, or Ken is basing, his entire premise on that idea. And for a skeptic, that is an extremely, extremely difficult proposition to defend.
Gives us a date at the end of the flood, and we look at the evidence that we have today of the fact that we know that there was ice in the past, we know there were glaciers in the past that advanced, because we see the evidence in the present. You can actually see
What evidence do we see?
Oh, glacially carved valleys. We can.
But you weren't there to see those glaciers
No,
carve
that's
those
true. That's true. We weren't.
You're okay with that, but you're not okay with neutron.
The difference with that is we can actually see what glaciers do. We've actually experienced what glaciers do, and we know the evidence that glaciers leave and evidence of moraine.
this is so bizarre because they Ken is so bent on this historical versus observational science. We can't be sure about the radio dating of ice cores because we weren't there to see the ice cores formed, but we are comfortable with inferences about glaciers because we can see glaciers move today. I wonder how Ken thought the atomic weapons and nuclear weapons that we have now and our nuclear power plants work. They work because we understand the atom, we understand radioactive decay, we control that decay in the cases of nuclear power plants, and we let that decay go unencumbered in nuclear weapons. So we absolutely have observational science to back up our understanding of radioactive decay, how neutrons behave in the nucleus of atoms, the types of nuclear radiation that unstable atoms give off in the form of alpha particles or helium nuclei, in the form of beta particles or electrons, and in the form of gamma radiation, and in the form of neutron emission. So I'm just baffled why, when this particular science of radioactive inquiry is only a century old, why that's not considered observational science when observing glaciers now to infer what glaciers did thousands of years ago is not historical science, but is observational science.
Rains and evidence of the way they
But
erode
what
things.
about sedimentation rates? What about neutrons in the water?
Sedimentation rates, it all depends on circumstances. I mean, if you weren't there, I mean, something could be deposited very quickly that you look at today and think was deposited slowly. I mean, if you didn't see it happen.
That's where we disagree.
No,
If you didn't see it happen, means it didn't happen.
No, I'm not. No,
So
you're
I
applying
don't,
something that's not
I'm
true.
open-minded, but I don't see any evidence for an ice age 4,000 years ago. There are
Okay,
pyramids older than
you've got a lot of
4,000
young
years
people
ago.
here. How would you convince them that there were ice
It's
ages
actually,
over hundreds
Mr.
of
Ham,
thousands
that's
of
my
years?
biggest concern. Is the young
I
people.
tell you my biggest concern, that you're teaching generations of these young people that are just animals, that they come about by natural processes. Aren't you teaching that humans are animals? Are we animals?
Yeah, we're
just
mammals.
animals?
Breathe air.
Okay.
Isn't that good?
So
This is the age-old argument that many in religious circles will use. If I'm an animal, then I might not be special to God. So therefore, I don't want to believe that I'm an animal. By this biological definition of animals, we are animals. Homo sapiens fit the scientific definition of an animal. For me personally, that doesn't necessarily have to diminish or defy or degrade God's work of putting humans on the planet, and for whatever reasons He chose, in choosing to engage in relationship with humans. Um, Most children have many toys, and they have a favorite toy or a few favorite toys that they enjoy playing with above all others. So I don't see or have a problem with the logic of humans being animals therefore degrades our relationship, or means that we're less special than what the text indicates. And by the text I mean Genesis chapter 1. And by the way, okay, so as I alluded to, I've talked with a few different Jewish people on the subject, a few different rabbis. I have some Jewish literature on the subject of Genesis, on the subject of science itself. And so I would not consider myself an expert in Jewish or Hebrew thought in any way, shape, or form. But I have tried to talk to various sources. I've tried to use what I've had at my disposal to learn what the Jewish community has to say regarding these texts. And by and large, what the purpose of Genesis 1 that I have been able to find from the various people that I've talked to and the books that I've read, the commentary I read from at the beginning included, what they all have to say about Genesis 1 and 2 is not to make a historically accurate and scientifically accurate document, right? The ancient Hebrews didn't have the notions of things like we do today. Number one, their thought process was not linear the way that we think about time. And number two, they didn't have the sophistication of our modern science. And so, suppose for just a moment that the Big Bang is true, okay? Suppose for just a moment the Big Bang is true, and that, number two, suppose that God caused the Big Bang. If you were God and you were trying to communicate this grand idea about the creation of the universe, the Big Bang, to an ancient group of nomadic and sheep herding tribes people who were surrounded by other nomadic and sheep herding tribes people who worshipped idols and made sacrifices to these idols, and in some cases those sacrifices were human sacrifices. You're in the midst of this ancient, violent survival mode culture who's just trying to get by from year to year and find their own identity. And you give this revelation of the creation of the universe to these people, you wouldn't talk to them in terms of light years, billions of years, parsecs, the Hubble expansion rate, and things of that nature, right? Those would be concepts that were beyond what they would understand. And if they wrote a book like that down, it would be nearly completely useless to them. So if God communicated to an ancient people in their own context, in their own place and time, about the creation of the universe, he would use descriptive language. He would use allegory, and he would use poetry, and he would use different forms of communication other than a literal approach, because it just simply would not make sense. And what Genesis, the first few chapters, are attempting to do, according to the people that I've talked to and the sources that I've read, more than anything, are not stating how God did it from a scientifically accurate standpoint, but that he did it. And that establishes a few things. Number one, it establishes who Yahweh is among the other pantheon of gods that were being worshipped by the tribes that the Hebrews were in and around and surrounded by. And it established the Hebrews as God's chosen people. And more than anything, that is what Genesis, the first few chapters, are about. That is the foundation upon which the rest of the Bible rests. not whether the universe was created in 6 literal days, when the word day doesn't have a meaning before day 4. Um, so it has always been a little bit bizarre to me, um, since I have uh, studied science on my own and at a professional level, for that interpretation to be held so dearly. It doesn't make too much sense to me why the demands for a literal interpretation are there. Again, I'm not trying to attack anyone's beliefs. I'm just simply stating my own mind and heart here, and what I believe the purpose of the first few chapters of Genesis to be. And when you view Genesis in that light, there's literally no conflict between um, any anything. There's literally no conflict between any of um, science and faith, because you can always allow for faith in God while accepting that the world operates due to natural order. And to me, that's the interpretation of the world that makes the most sense if you're going to look at it from a religious point of view. So I think we're going to pause this video here. Um, as you go through this video, again, it can be a bit of a difficult watch. So be prepared. You'll get frustrated at the demeanor of both Ham and Nye, as they interact with one another, and you can tell their frustration with each other is growing, because neither will yield to the other's point of view. But if you've stuck with me this far, I appreciate it, and we will see you in the next video.